There is a car sitting in a repair yard somewhere in Casablanca right now. It has no air conditioning. Its odometer stopped counting decades ago. Its paint has gone from whatever color it once was to something closer to desert and time. A mechanic is underneath it, doing what mechanics in Morocco have been doing to this model for over 40 years. Fixing it, sending it back out. That car is a Mercedes-Benz. It was built in Stuttgart in 1980. It is still working. This is the story of why that happened. And it is stranger than it sounds. In January 1976, a special German Federal Railways train pulled out of Stuttgart heading south toward France. It was carrying cargo, not machinery, not industrial parts, but automobiles. 33 of them, in various configurations, shipped in secret along the rail network so they could not be observed on the roads. The destination was Bandol, on the Côte d'Azur, and the Paul Ricard racing circuit nearby. The occasion was the press launch of a new Mercedes. The secrecy was not unusual for the era. Automotive press launches were theatrical events, carefully choreographed to control exactly what journalists saw and when. But the car being revealed was unusual in a way that had nothing to do with theater. Mercedes had built something that was almost philosophically different from what most of the automotive world was doing at the time, and in the years that followed, the world would slowly begin to realize it. The car was called the W123. It would become the best-selling Mercedes in the company's history up to that point, with nearly 2.7 million produced before production ended in 1985 and 1986. It would serve as a taxi in West Germany, as a government vehicle in developing nations, as a family car across Europe, as a workhorse in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. It would be the car that German taxi drivers trusted to run 400,000 miles before a major overhaul. It would be the car that Morocco would eventually have to pay its drivers to stop using. And it would be remembered, decades after it left production, as perhaps the clearest example in automotive history of what happens when an engineering organization decides that the job is not to build the most modern car, but to build the most honest one. To understand why Mercedes built it this way, you have to understand where Mercedes had come from. By 1945, the Daimler-Benz company effectively did not exist. The Sindelfingen plant, where passenger cars were built, had been struck by 14 Allied bombing raids between 1941 and 1945. The Untertürkheim facility was heavily damaged. At one of the first directors' meetings after the war ended, the company's leadership made a statement that was historically accurate. Daimler-Benz, as it had been, had ceased to exist. What remained was physically damaged factories, a workforce decimated by the war, a reputation entangled with the Nazi industrial apparatus, and a name that carried the memory of some of the greatest engineering in European history. The Benz patent motor car of 1886 was the first true automobile. Before the war, Mercedes had built racing cars that dominated European competition. The Silver Arrows had been the fastest cars in the world. None of that meant anything now. The men who began rebuilding the company in 1945 made a decision that would define Mercedes for the next 40 years. Since everything else had been stripped away, factories, foreign markets, international standing, the only thing the company could offer was quality. Not luxury in the conventional sense of comfort and decoration, but engineering quality. The kind that could be verified, the kind that lasted. This was not entirely idealism. It was the only competitive advantage a German manufacturer could credibly claim in 1945. The markets that existed in the immediate post-war years demanded trucks, utility vehicles, basic transport. When passenger car production gradually resumed in the late 1940s and early 1950s, customers were cautious. Money was limited. Nobody wanted a car that was going to break. So Daimler-Benz built cars that would not break. And it did this systematically, not as a marketing posture, but as an engineering requirement. The philosophy was captured in a phrase later attributed to Hans Scherenberg, who would serve as the company's director of research and development from 1965 to 1977. According to Scherenberg, true elegance meant staying just behind fashion, not chasing it. A Mercedes should not look dated in 10 years. It should look considered. By the time Scherenberg and the design team under Friedrich Geiger, and more precisely, a young Italian-German designer named Bruno Sacco, who was working under Geiger, began developing what would become the W123 in the early 1970s. This philosophy had built Mercedes into something remarkable. The company had survived the war. It had rebuilt its factories. Its cars were selling across Europe and in the United States. The three-pointed star had become exactly what the post-war leadership had intended. A symbol of German engineering quality that transcended the catastrophe that had destroyed the original company. The problem was that the 1970s were not the 1950s, and the automotive world was changing in ways that would make the W123's particular form of honesty unexpectedly urgent. If you watched the television news in October 1973, you might have seen images that seemed impossible in the modern industrialized world. Empty roads, German autobahns with almost no traffic, American gas stations with hand-lettered signs saying they were out of fuel. In the Netherlands, Sundays were declared car-free days. People rode bicycles through cities that normally choked with automobiles. The 1973 oil embargo, organized by the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, in response to Western support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War, had cut oil supplies to much of the developed world. Prices quadrupled almost overnight. Governments introduced rationing. The economic disruption was immediate and severe. Entire industries that had been built on cheap fuel were suddenly exposed to a reality they had been avoiding for decades. For the automotive industry, the implications were complicated. Large, thirsty American cars suddenly looked like financial liabilities. Fuel efficiency became a concern that it had never been in the post-war prosperity era. Buyers who had assumed that fuel was essentially free began reconsidering what they wanted from a car, and diesel engines, which consumed less fuel and ran on a cheaper grade of petroleum product, went from being considered slow and unrefined to looking surprisingly practical. Mercedes had been building diesel passenger cars for decades. The 260D of 1936 had been the first standard production diesel passenger car available for sale worldwide. By the mid-1970s, diesel engines were well established in Mercedes's lineup. The oil crisis did not create Mercedes's diesel competence. It made the world suddenly interested in it. This was the economic environment into which the W123 was launched in January 1976. And it partially explains why diesel versions of the W123, particularly the 5-cylinder 3.0-liter OM617 engine, would eventually account for the car's most enduring reputation. But the fuel crisis was only the background pressure. The W123 itself was a response to something more fundamental than a temporary shortage of petroleum. The car that the W123 replaced was the W114 and W115 series, commonly called the Stroke 8 by enthusiasts, which had been in production since 1968. It was a respected car, selling nearly 2 million units across its 8-year production run. But by the early 1970s, as development work on the W123 began in earnest, the Stroke 8 was beginning to feel its age. The automotive world had moved. BMW had introduced a new generation of 6-cylinder sedans that were sharper and more dynamic. Safety regulations were tightening in Europe, and especially in North America. Customers expected more from a car for the price Mercedes was charging. Chief engineer Hans Scherenberg set out what the new car had to achieve. The design goals, recorded at the time, called for something specific: a balanced, dynamic, non-aggressive form that emphasized horizontal lines to suggest stability and character. The car should look calm, not aggressive. It should look like a Mercedes. Bruno Sacco, who had joined Daimler-Benz in 1958 and was working closely under Friedrich Geiger, developed the exterior. The approach Sacco followed was one he would formalize as head of Mercedes design for the following decades. Cars should age gracefully. They should not chase the trends of the moment, because trends become dated. They should be designed to look correct for as long as possible. When you look at the W123 today, its clean horizontal surfaces, its measured proportions, its lack of decorative detail that might look fashionable in 1976 and embarrassing in 1986, you can see exactly what Sacco was doing. But the more important decisions were not visible. They were buried in the engineering specifications, the material choices, the production tolerances, and they represented something that the automotive industry was, at that moment, beginning to quietly move away from. If you were a shareholder in a car company in the mid-1970s, you were interested in a concept that had been quietly shaping automotive production for decades: planned obsolescence. The idea that cars should be built to last a certain number of years, long enough to feel reliable, short enough to encourage replacement, was not officially company policy anywhere, but it was the economic logic underneath a great deal of product planning. A car that lasted too long was a car that its owner did not replace. A car that needed repairs after 7 years was a car that drove its owner back to a dealership. Mercedes, in building the W123, made a choice that ran directly counter to this logic. The choice was not announced. It was not publicized. It was made in engineering workshops in Stuttgart and Sindelfingen, in decisions about which steel to use, how thick to make it, which seals to specify, how much testing to require, what tolerances to accept. Mercedes specified that the W123's body panels should resist corrosion for 16 years, not 7 years, not 10 years, 16. The suspension components were designed to last for hundreds of thousands of miles under normal use. The OM6117 5-cylinder diesel engine, the version that would make the most lasting impression on the world, was engineered by the company's own specification to run for 1 million kilometers before requiring major service. 1 million kilometers. To put that in terms of daily life, if you drove 20,000 kilometers a year, a reasonable annual distance for an active driver, an OM617 equipped W123 was designed to last 50 years of regular use before its engine would need a major overhaul. This was not marketing. There was no advertisement that said this. It was a specification written by engineers at a factory in Stuttgart who believed that this was simply the standard to which a Mercedes should be built. When the W123 went on sale in early 1976, demand immediately exceeded what Mercedes could produce. Following a slow production buildup during the first year, customers who placed orders faced waiting periods of 9 to 12 months. What happened next was something that happens in very few automotive markets and almost never for ordinary family sedans. A black market emerged. Buyers who could not wait for official delivery were paying premiums above the list price to get cars sooner. The car that Hans Scherenberg had described in measured language about horizontal lines and balanced forms had created a shortage that no car maker wants to manage, and every car maker dreams of having. This was partly the result of the car's quality immediately becoming apparent to the market. European taxi operators, who drove more miles in a year than most private customers drive in 5, understood Mercedes diesel quality from previous models. When the W123 arrived with its OM616 and OM617 diesel engines, German taxi fleets placed orders in volumes that put pressure on supply for private customers. Taxi operators in West Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and across Western Europe were not buying W123s because they looked impressive. They were buying them because the economics of the taxi trade made the calculation straightforward. A car that lasted 3 times as long as a competitor was worth paying more for upfront. By the early 1980s, West German taxi fleets were reporting examples with 300,000, 400,000, and 500,000 kilometers on the odometer, requiring nothing more than regular service. A vehicle that went into taxi service in Frankfurt or Hamburg in 1976 and was still running reliably in 1984 was not a curiosity. It was a W123. Meanwhile, what was happening inside the car's engine was something that had very few precedents in mass production automotive history. The OM617, the 5-cylinder diesel that would become the most celebrated component in the W123's story, had been designed with what one later analysis described as an almost industrial mentality. It was not refined the way a performance engine is refined, to extract maximum output. It was engineered the way a piece of industrial machinery is engineered, to run reliably at moderate stress for an extraordinarily long time. The indirect injection design prioritized low-end torque and smooth operation over outright speed. Outputs were modest by petrol standards, but the internal clearances, the materials, the cooling systems, the oil circulation, all of it was specified with longevity as the primary criterion. If you subscribe to the emerging automotive philosophy that quality and cost needed to be balanced, that no component should be significantly more durable than any other component, that a car should be designed to last exactly as long as was commercially appropriate, the W123 made no sense. It was over-engineered by any normal commercial standard. That was the point. If you enjoy discovering the hidden history behind the cars you've known your entire life, consider subscribing to the Cars We Know 2.0. Most of you watching are on TV, so if you can, find the channel, subscribe, and share this with someone who'd love it. It means everything for the future of the channel. By the late 1970s, the W123 was operating in a world that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the economic implications of what it had built. The success of the car had demonstrated something that was both gratifying and, from a certain business perspective, slightly problematic. A car that lasted this long was a car whose owners did not come back to buy a new one. The German taxi operators who had bought W123s in 1976 were still using the same vehicles in 1983. They were happy. They were loyal to the brand. But they were not buying new cars. This tension would eventually influence the car that replaced the W123, the W124, which entered development in 1976, the same year the W123 launched, and reached customers in 1985. The W124 was itself a very well-engineered car, widely respected, and also long-lived by the standards of its time. But insiders and enthusiasts have noted for decades that the W124 was not quite the same as the W123. It was excellent. It was not quite as absolute in its engineering philosophy. Costs had to be managed. Production had to be profitable. Even Mercedes had to acknowledge that a car designed to run for 1 million kilometers without major service was, by some definitions, too good. There is a particular irony in this. The W123 was so well built that it partly justified the argument for building its successor to a slightly lower standard. The world had learned that a 1 million kilometer engine was possible. It had also learned that nobody really needed one, but that particular commercial logic was running in Europe and North America. Somewhere else, the conversation was entirely different. In the 1970s and 1980s, the average age of cars in Western Europe was less than 7 years. European consumers bought new cars regularly, sometimes more out of habit than necessity. Manufacturers relied on this cycle. Cars that had been reliable for 5 or 6 years were traded in. The used car market absorbed them for a few more years, and eventually they reached the end of their useful lives and were scrapped. Except that a W123 reaching the end of its useful life in West Germany or the Netherlands in 1984 had, by any objective measure, barely started. What happened next was the consequence of a simple economic fact meeting an extraordinary piece of engineering. Exporters in Western Europe recognized that a 10-year-old W123 diesel, deemed too old for the European market, traded in for something newer, was still a functional, robust vehicle with enormous potential remaining life. African importers recognized the same thing, and the economics worked. A car that European consumers were discarding at a fraction of its original value was, in markets where new vehicles were inaccessible, an extremely valuable asset. Thousands of W123s began moving through export channels from Western Europe to North Africa, West Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The destination that would become most strongly associated with this migration was Morocco. In the cities of Casablanca, Marrakesh, Fez, and Essaouira, the W123 specifically the 240D diesel variant, began appearing as what Moroccans would call grand taxis, shared long-distance taxis that carried passengers between cities on routes that ordinary bus services did not cover. The logic was the same as what the German taxi operators had understood a decade earlier, now operating in a completely different context. A 240D that had already covered 200,000 kilometers in Europe and been traded in as used up was, in Morocco, a vehicle with perhaps another 500,000 kilometers of life remaining, under conditions that would have destroyed most cars: extreme heat, rough roads, irregular maintenance, diesel fuel of variable quality. The W123 endured. What emerged over the following decades was something that no car company had ever achieved by design. A vehicle whose reputation for reliability was being actively proven, in real time, on the other side of the world, by people who had no connection to the marketing department in Stuttgart and no reason to be generous in their assessment. Moroccan taxi drivers were not enthusiasts. They were working people running, working vehicles. If the car had been unreliable, they would have used something else. There was no loyalty to the brand beyond what the car demonstrated every morning when it started. It started every morning. By 2014, roughly 38 years after the W123 had entered production, Morocco had approximately 55,000 W123 taxis still in active daily service. The Moroccan government, citing environmental and safety concerns, launched a cash for clunkers program, offering drivers 80,000 dirhams, around $6,500 to scrap their W123s and replace them with new vehicles. The program met resistance. Drivers who had run these cars for decades were skeptical that anything new would be as reliable. Even with the government incentive, the phase-out took years. A government had to pay people to stop using a car built in 1976. That is not a marketing claim. That is a documented historical outcome. In the United States, the W123 arrived as the 240D and 300D in 1977 and was greeted by a market still dealing with the consequences of the 1973 oil crisis and its 1979 sequel. American buyers who had spent a decade assuming that large V8 engines were a birthright were now confronting fuel costs that made that assumption painful. The W123 diesel, with its ability to achieve 30 miles per gallon or better, offered something almost no other European luxury car could claim: economy combined with a genuine claim to durability. The car became a fixture in specific American communities: academics, professionals, people who made a point of buying things that lasted. It was not a glamorous car in the American market. It was not fast. The 240D's four-cylinder diesel produced somewhere around 62 horsepower, which made it, by American standards, extraordinarily slow. A fully loaded 240D needed approximately 20 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour. Drivers who had grown up with American muscle did not enjoy this. But there was a group of buyers who didn't care about any of that. They were people who valued the idea of a car that would not need replacing. People who had calculated, correctly, that a W123 diesel maintained properly would cost less over 15 years than almost any alternative. People who had concluded that reliability was more valuable than performance or style. These buyers kept their W123s for decades. Some of them still have them. There is a community of W123 owners in the United States today who treat these cars less as classic vehicles and more as ongoing transportation, not vintage objects to be preserved, but working machines to be maintained. The OM617 engine, which Mercedes designed to run for 1 million kilometers, has in many documented American cases been running for 40 or more years. The cars are maintained by mechanics who specialize in them. Parts, remarkably, are still manufactured and available. The supply chain for a car that left production in 1985 remains functional in 2026 because enough of these cars are still running to justify it. Back in Sindelfingen, in the design offices and engineering workshops where the W123 had been created, the car's success raised questions that did not have entirely comfortable answers. The W123 had been built to a standard that was, strictly speaking, unnecessary. No customer needed a car to last 1,000,000 kilometers. No market required it. The decision to engineer the OM617 to that specification was a philosophical one, rooted in a particular understanding of what Mercedes meant, that the car should be built to the absolute limit of what was possible, not to the limit of what the market required. This philosophy had worked. The W123 had become the company's most successful model, but it had worked in a way that made the philosophy increasingly difficult to justify to shareholders and product planners who were calculating return on investment. The W124, which replaced the W123 starting in 1985, was also highly regarded, also durable, also well-engineered. But as the Petrolicious Automotive magazine later wrote, reflecting on the transition, the W124 was easier to produce and significantly cheaper to build, with less of the build quality W123 owners had come to expect. The replacement models were designed for a newer type of customer, one who thought differently about what a car should be. And critically, by the time the W123 left production in 1985 and 1986, there were still waiting lists. Customers in Europe were still placing orders for a car that was technically obsolete, superseded by its successor, because they trusted it and had no equivalent reason to trust anything that replaced it. That waiting list for a departing model is, as one automotive historian has noted, almost certainly a record for a production saloon car. What does it mean when a car's production ends and the waiting list is still full? The world that needed the W123 was a specific world. It was a world of recent economic shock, of fuel insecurity, of customers who had learned that cheap energy could disappear. It was a world in which Germany needed to rebuild its industrial identity on the foundation of quality rather than scale. It was a world in which taxi operators across Europe needed a car whose economics made sense over 500,000 kilometers rather than 50,000. And it was a world in which, on the other side of the Mediterranean, used European vehicles were the only affordable form of mobility for vast populations. The W123 was designed by a company that had rebuilt itself from nothing on the promise of engineering honesty. It was built under a chief engineer who believed that elegance meant staying just behind fashion, never chasing it. It was styled by a designer, Bruno Sacco, who believed that a car should be designed to age gracefully, not to impress in the year of its launch. It was powered, in its most enduring form, by an engine built not to be fast, but to be permanent. None of these decisions were made with Morocco in mind. None of them were made with the image of a 40-year-old diesel crawling through the streets of Marrakesh. They were made in Stuttgart, by engineers applying a philosophy that was already beginning to seem economically irrational at the time they applied it. But here is what that philosophy produced: a machine that outlived the political structures of the era in which it was made. The W123 entered production in West Germany, a country that no longer exists. It was built during the Cold War, during the oil crisis era, during a decade of economic turbulence that reshaped the industrialized world. All of those things are now history. The car is still running, in an industry increasingly organized around planned obsolescence, around software-managed lifespans, around the idea that a car's value depreciates because it is designed to. The W123 represents something that the industry largely decided was unviable. The idea that a car should simply be built as well as possible and then trusted to prove the point. The people who drive battered W123 taxis through the streets of Casablanca today, and as of recent years, there are still some, did not choose those cars because they are fans of 1970s German automotive design. They chose them because they work, because they have always worked, because whatever happened to fuel quality, road conditions, maintenance schedules, or the passage of time, those cars kept starting in the morning. That is a reputation earned across continents and decades and 1 billion kilometers of difficult roads. Mercedes-Benz didn't plan that legacy. They just built a car that deserved it. And oddly, the car that made that kind of engineering philosophy seem too expensive to sustain has become the most enduring argument for why it shouldn't have been abandoned. The automotive industry moved on. The W123 didn't. It just kept going. As it turns out, that was always the point. There is one final irony worth noting. The company that decided the W123 philosophy was too costly to repeat has spent the decades since building increasingly complex technology-heavy vehicles, whose long-term reliability has been the subject of considerable debate. The brand that once built cars to last 1 million kilometers now builds cars that, by several independent assessments, require more software updates and more frequent attention than the mechanical simplicity of the W123 could have dreamed of. The star on the hood remains the same. The philosophy beneath it has changed considerably in Morocco, in Lagos, in Beirut, in suburban American garages, and in the collections of enthusiasts who understand that some machines earn their reputation on roads rather than in brochures. The W123 keeps running, and when it finally stops, it will have done what Hans Scharenberg's engineers intended. It will have lasted long enough that the world noticed. The W124 that replaced it was a remarkable car in its own right. One of the last Mercedes that followed closely in the W123's engineering tradition before the industry fully shifted its priorities. But that is a different story and a different set of decisions. Because it turns out that what happens after you build the most durable car in the world is almost as interesting as how you built it in the first place.